The Titanic's wireless sent its final distress calls in the small hours of April 15, 1912. They came as tiny bursts of code and human voice. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride tapped out CQD and SOS while water filled the forward compartments, and those last transmissions became the only lifeline between hundreds of people and the outside world. Nearby ships heard, or didn't. Because some sets were manned and some were dark, the Carpathia steamed toward the faint CQD while the Californian silence left lifeboats without help, and that gap between signal and response was measured in miles and lives. It mattered. Inside the wireless room, the mood was urgent and exhausted. Voices overlapped, messages repeated. Phillips read out positions, Bride relayed pleas, and because static and fear shredded clarity, rescuers had to reconstruct a map of the disaster from fragments of Morse and broken sentences. Those crackled lines still shape testimony and headlines today. By following the exact words, the moments they were sent, and who sent them, you can see how a handful of transmitted syllables steered rescue efforts, influenced inquiries, and hardened the myths that followed. You'll hear the transcripts and timing, and understand why every scratch of that wireless mattered. 1. The Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic late on April 14, 1912. A sudden, almost imperceptible shudder ran through the ship, breaking the stillness of an unusually calm night, and that quiet made everything worse. The sea was flat as glass and there was no moon, so silhouettes were hard to pick out against the dark horizon. The Titanic was moving fast, about 21 to 22 knots, which closed any margin for error. Warnings about ice had come in from several ships earlier, Mesaba among them, but the warnings arrived while the liner kept up near maximum speed, and the lookouts on deck did not have binoculars to give them a longer early view. A lookout finally spotted the iceberg and rang the warning bell, a single sharp call that set men on the bridge moving. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were the men up there, and their shout reached the bridge just before 11:40 at night. First Officer William Murdoch gave the commands to turn hard and to reverse the engines, and the helmsman and engine crew obeyed instantly. Those maneuvers slowed the inevitable, but they only changed the angle of contact rather than preventing it. The hull never struck like a clean, single blow. The iceberg scraped along the starboard bow, buckling plates and opening seams over several adjoining compartments. That scraping action sliced open the forward hull in multiple places along the plates and rivet lines, and water began to pour in where the steel had separated. The ship's watertight design could survive a few flooded compartments, but the iceberg's damage breached 5 forward compartments, which was more than the design could handle. On board, the effect was immediate and practical. The bow started to take on water and settle lower, while the stern rode up. Pumps ran and crewmen hurried to inspect and assess, but the list and trim were already changing noticeably. Captain Edward Smith was informed, and the bridge staff began counting how many compartments were filling. It was clear even in those first minutes that the collision had set in motion a sequence, impact, flooding, progressive loss of buoyancy, that the ship's design had not been able to contain. 2. The ship's wireless station began sending distress calls and coordinates to nearby vessels. There was a sudden urgency in the Marconi room when the first wires began to click. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips at the key and his younger colleague Harold Bride at his side, started sending formal distress signals to any ship that would listen, using the ship's call sign, MGY, and repeating the emergency codes in Morse so other stations could pick them up clearly. Because Morse is brief and exact, they could cram a lot of information into a few minutes of transmission. The nature of the emergency, the fact that lifeboats were being launched, and the ship's position as given by the bridge's navigators. That position was sent as latitude and longitude, the standard practice for directing responding vessels, and those numeric coordinates became the anchor for every ship that turned toward the scene. There was real pressure on the operators to be both fast and precise. Phillips and Bride alternated between the older distress calls CQD and the newer SOS as they hammered out sequences of dots and dashes, because using both increased the chances that distant receivers would understand. MGY's messages included both the plea for help and the coordinates taken from Titanic's navigation logs. Sending coordinates meant translating the bridge's bearings and dead reckoning fixes into a short string of numbers for Morse transmission, and operators would repeat those numbers several times to guard against static or interference. When those numbers reached other ships, they could be plotted on a chart almost immediately, allowing captains to pick a heading without waiting for more details. There was also immediate, visible response from some ships and frustrating silence from others. The wireless operator aboard the steamship Carpathia, Harold Cottam, received Titanic's distress calls and woke his captain, who ordered a change of course and maximum steam toward the reported coordinates. that decision to turn was directly caused by the radio traffic and brought help that would later pick up survivors. By contrast, the nearby Californian did not respond effectively because a wireless operator had gone off duty, leaving the ship unaware of the repeated distress traffic, and that lack of reception meant rockets and other signals went unanswered. Other vessels, like Mount Temple and Baltic, acknowledged the messages and knocked off other tasks to move toward the coordinates, but distance and ice fields limited how quickly any one ship could arrive. There were limits to what those wireless calls could accomplish, and those limits mattered. Atmospheric interference, spark gap transmitter noise from other ships, and the constraints of range all affected whether a given vessel heard MGY. In addition, the coordinates sent were only as accurate as the ship's own night navigation, so searchers later found that the position reported by radio did not match the wreck site exactly. Because of those technical and human factors, the distress calls mobilized the closest capable ships and saved many lives, while at the same time exposing gaps, like unattended wireless sets and overburdened operators, that directly shaped how quickly assistance could arrive. 3. As the situation worsened, messages grew shorter amid rising chaos on board. Even as the operators sent out the first distress calls, you could hear a change in the rhythm of the traffic. Messages that once contained coordinates and detailed descriptions became clipped and urgent. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride began with the usual formalities, the ship's call letters and a description of the collision. But as the bow dipped and the list increased, the transmission shifted to a handful of repeated signals. That shift happened because there was less time and more to lose. Every added second at the key could mean another inch of water or another hatch jammed. Noise on deck made long conversation impossible, and that forced short, direct bursts of information from the wireless cabin. Engines, shouting crew, and the rush of people moving above sent sound and movement through the bulkheads. Operators had to pause long enough to tap out essentials and then get back to survival tasks. Equipment stress played a role too. As power faltered and the ship's systems were affected, the set's effective range and reliability dropped, so operators concentrated on the one thing that mattered most, making sure someone, somewhere, knew they needed immediate help. Under that pressure, the content of the messages narrowed to essentials: the distress signal, the ship's identity, and the barest hint of location or condition. Instead of paragraphs of information, receiving stations heard repeated calls like MGY, CQD or SOS, and then a few terse words about sinking or needing boats. The cause and effect was plain. Operators condensed to avoid wasting time and to overcome fading gear, and a repeated, blunt pattern emerged because brevity increased the chance that a signal would be caught before interference or power loss wiped it out. That compression of language changed how other ships and shore stations responded, forcing them to interpret minimal data and act fast. Carpathia and other wireless operators had to guess at exactly what was happening from short, fragmented reports and then alter course immediately. The consequence was a rescue effort launched on raw urgency rather than step-by-step instructions, a situation born directly from the combination of rising water, failing systems, and human necessity to keep messages as short and clear as possible. 4. Communication continued only as long as power and equipment allowed. You could hear the urgency in the clicks before the hum went. The Marconi apparatus on board needed the ship's dynamos to throw a powerful spark and reach ships far away, so as the flooding and engine trouble ate into the power supply, the strength of every transmission fell off. Operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride kept sending CQD and SOS signals, but the set that could reach Cape Race at full strength could only push a fading whisper once the main electrical plant began to fail. Because the wireless depended on steam-driven generators down in the engine spaces, any ingress of water there translated directly into shorter range and fewer ships able to pick up the call. The rhythm changed from steady messages to ragged bursts. Once the dynamos weakened, the only hope was auxiliary batteries and jury-rigged connections, which survivors later described in plain terms. Small batteries can give you a signal, but they don't give you the same reach. That reduced range meant that a ship 50 miles away might no longer hear the Morse that had been clear an hour earlier. As a direct result, replies dwindled and confirmations that had once steered rescue courses became scarce. You could see the equipment losing the fight as seawater crept in. Saltwater shorted wiring and corroded contacts. Aerial wires that needed to be taut and high were dragged down as deck structures warped and broke. When that happened, the spark gap and the antenna could not form the clean circuit needed for long-distance transmission, so even if a battery still pushed current, the transmission scattered and faded. In plain terms, wet metal and a broken aerial turn a powerful radio into a useless lamp. The final silence was not sudden but cumulative. Operators strained to get the last messages out, and when the main power went, the wireless did not die instantly. It sputtered, hopped, and then fell away as more systems flooded and the crew fled. Because of that cascade, ships that had been alerted earlier, most notably Carpathia, kept heading to the last known bearings, while others that might have helped never received a clear, sustained call. The practical consequence was that when the wireless fell quiet, the remaining rescue effort shifted from coordinated radio direction to desperate visual searches, and the plaintive bearings already passed on before the set failed. 5. After the final transmissions, Titanic's radio fell silent and no further messages came through. A sudden hush on the wireless felt like the last line of a conversation cut off mid-sentence. Operators had been exchanging urgent CQD and SOS calls for hours. Then the signal stopped coming through. Harold Bride later told investigators that water rose into the wireless cabin and began to short out the equipment, and that the men kept working until the apparatus could no longer function. That flooding and the failure of the ship's power supply are the clearest, documented reasons why no further messages were transmitted. When the Marconi room went quiet, nearby vessels were left with only the last bearings and fragments of information to act on. Ships like Carpathia adjusted course and steamed hard toward the last known signals, but without fresh updates they had to estimate where to search. The lack of ongoing radio traffic also meant that ships which might have been able to help, such as the one whose wireless had been turned off that night, missed the window to respond in time. The technical cascade was simple in effect and complex in detail. Flooding reached electrical spaces, seawater bridged circuits, and power from the boilers, which supplied current for the wireless gear, was lost as compartments flooded. Antennae and wiring would have been strained or submerged as the ship listed and sank, making transmission physically impossible even if operators remained at their posts. Bride's account that the apparatus was rendered useless by incoming water explains why frantic calls stopped abruptly. The silence changed everything for those waiting ashore and for the rescue effort at sea. Families and shore stations had no way to get minute-by-minute updates. Rescue ships had to rely on exhausted estimates and on-search procedures. In the end, the absence of any further wireless traffic became both a practical obstacle to immediate rescue coordination and a stark, human sign that the vessel's condition had passed the point where radio could make a difference. It was a night of ice and urgency. In the early hours of April 15, 1912, Titanic's Marconi room sent steady, desperate traffic. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride trading CQD for the new SOS, calling for help that reached ships like the Carpathia and others some hours later, but not soon enough, because wireless range was limited, because messages crossed and the operators were exhausted, because the iceberg damage made the ship sink before enough boats could carry everyone. About 500 people ended up losing their lives. When you imagine the crackle and the human voices, the clipped formalities, the sudden shifts to frantic coordinates, the terse come at once, it makes the technical details feel very small and very immediate. You feel how thin the lifeline was. History keeps asking questions. If you want to follow the threads, the limits of Marconi wireless, the Carpathia's long run through ice, the operator's exhaustion, and the inquiry transcripts that piece together those final hours, there are links below and a next episode coming that dives into the people who kept the radio going and the legal and human aftermath they left behind. Those last radio messages mattered because they were concrete actions in real time. Coordinates set a course, distress calls pulled ships out of fog, survivor names and times became evidence for investigations, and the crackling logs shape how we remember the night. We keep listening.